Welcome to Introduction to Intrapreneurship, leveraging entrepreneurial skills to drive change at work. Many have heard of the word entrepreneur, I'm sure, but intrapreneur is a word coined by Gifford Pinchot III, and it looks at taking those same skills to drive change and initiatives at work. Just a bit of housekeeping. I'm Jeffrey Garwood, and the views expressed in this are mine and not necessarily any of my employers, past, present, or other parties. So with that, let's get started. I'd like to open it up for you to take a look at this statue that was designed by Da Vinci. So basically, just for scale, the horse's knee is approximately a person's height. So what I'd like you to do is just take a good look at this horse for a minute. So basically, Da Vinci created this statue. And if you look and try to pick up, what do you get from this statue, right? The muscles are tense like it's moving forward. The nostrils are flaring. Everything about it conveys movement and power. So, did Da Vinci just wake up and one day say, wow, this is what I'm going to draw? And he made this horse. And, clearly he's a genius. But at the end of the day, what Da Vinci was a really acute observer of life. So what he did was his whole thing was to observe everything around him really intently. So for everything from when he did the Mona Lisa, right? It has multiple layers of paint because he studied how light refracted through paint just so that it had a glow, right? So the original Mona Lisa actually had a lifelike glow just because Da Vinci studied color and translucency so intently. So if we kind of look at what it took for him to create that horse statue, what he did was he looked at everything there was about horses. He looked at their sizes, their shape, their movement, their muscles, their skeletal structure. His whole technique was to understand and observe something so carefully and so closely that he could draw out subtle things that other people missed. Right? And that's part of the genius of how Da Vinci basically created that and multiple other things. So nothing. The Codex sold for $30 million to Bill Gates because all his drawings are such genius, right? So the fact that he was able to capture all those details was truly a testament to his genius. Now, I'm not expecting all of us to do that, right? But what I am suggesting is if we start to observe things more closely, we're going to find opportunities for innovation in our everyday, right? So as we're going, there's always opportunity to observe and improve, right? Whether it's up front or along the way. So how do we improve our techniques to do that? What does it mean to be observant, right? How do we train ourselves to look at things much more closely? So if you think about your morning, right? You probably woke up, grabbed the same coffee cup, went through your routine, and walked by 900 things that you pretty much forgotten, right? It's kind of that effect that you find this amazing lamp in the catalog. It goes in your house for the first 3 weeks, you look at it every day, and then you never look at it again, right? Things actually start to blur into the background because we're just trained by natural selection to look for things that are jumping out at us, right? So one of the things I'm going to suggest is as you go through your day, stop for a minute, right? Stop and really look at something. So when I say look at one thing, it could be the test instrument, what testing instrument you're using, diagnostic instrument, could be the application you're logging into in the morning, could be your desk, could be anything around you, right? And when I say look, you probably just looked. My guess is 99%, maybe less, took a look at it, right? But what I'm talking about is really looking at it. So stopping and looking at the details, right? Looking at the buttons, looking at the colors. Why is it where it's at? Why did they choose that layout? And really taking a moment to take it in. So digging down into those details, really. Now, once you've done that, take a step back, right? Why is it where it's at? What's the context it's in? What's the room it's in? Why is that room next to the room it's in? Right? So letting yourself take in, just observing day to day things that are around you. Now, I know it sounds like extremely simple, but it's amazing how you can go through day after day, almost in a routine and not really take in the details. Right? So first step I'm suggesting to try to drive more innovation is to train your ability, excuse me, train your ability to really look at those details. So besides that, we all know there's a backdrop of pressures around us, right, that are pushing change. So obviously technology is speeding up. If you look at artificial intelligence, it's been around a good while, right? But it wasn't until just recently that the tools and techniques got commoditized enough that they're basically being embedded into everything, right? So we will see that continuing. There's going to be those kind of pressures. There's also going to be societal shifts that we're dealing with, right? So thinking about the millennial generation is now in 2019 became the #1 generation, largest population generation. They have a different expectation. And one of those is the experience, right? There's a book called The Experience Economy, which is basically saying that it's not about the product necessarily. It's not about the service. It's about the journey they went with you on that experience, right? So that overall feeling and experience they had along the way is as important as the thing itself, if not more so. And then we all saw with COVID, right? Excuse me. COVID, that we were definitely driven toward the remote and the in-person, right? So where before those two were really two disconnected sometimes experiences, second, the remote was kind of a, yeah, we're going to provide it thing. It wasn't a primary thing, has now become extremely important. And the other piece that's, I think, changed, if you think about the experience, is that the expectation that that brand experience of any company is going to transcend both of those experiences, right? So your institution's brand needs to be reflected equally across both. So part of our job with innovation is how do we start to think and prepare and adapt for those, right? We just have to know that that's coming and figure out how we're going to keep preparing and be ready for that. Now, to do that, we're going to have to start thinking differently. And, it's easy to say, right? Think differently. But it's really tough to do, right? So we all, consciously or unconsciously, we have a box that we live in sometimes. So how do we start to think outside of that box a little bit? First thing is, when you did some observing, right? And there's a concept called the 5 whys. It was developed by Toyota. It's basically you keep asking why, like a kid naturally would. Why? Again and again, trying to get to the root of what the underlying condition is, right? Don't just take the surface effect or the apparent issue, right? That thing's beeping because it always beeps, right? Why is it beeping? Because this. Is it maybe 5 systems downstream that's actually driving that? Now, that's great. What I'm suggesting is we take the 5 whys and we extend those a little bit. So why is it the way it is, right? So when you're looking at whatever that machine is or whatever that application is, why is it the way it is? Does it have to stay that way, right? If we take 2 seconds and say, can we change that? And why hasn't it changed already? Maybe it just wasn't a big enough problem. Or maybe just it's what we've always done and nobody's really rethought it. The harder part is, why should I change this, right? At some point, you have to decide whether it's worth what is going to be a pretty significant effort to drive change. And one way to get to that is writer Simon Sinek. He has a fantastic set of YouTubes too. He basically lays out this concept of the clarity of why, that why matters more than what you do, right? So people will buy why you do it, not what you do. So what I mean by that is both your institution and you have fundamental drivers and principles that are kind of your North Star, right? And all the what you do's support that. But at the end of the day, you have to figure out, if I'm going to make this change and I see something that I want to drive change, why is it going to set a new standard? Why is it going to drive positive change, make an impact? And why do I really believe and care in it, right? Because at the end of the day, that's what's going to carry you through. Another trap we fall into is that we we think of how we're going to do something, right? So if you think about drills as an example, if I was going to sell you drills, whether it's surgical, mechanical, electrical drill, whatever you're going to drill, you're probably talking about how fast it can turn, how strong it is, how many drills can I, how many times can I use it? At the end of the day, that's not the job that's getting done, right? The job that's getting done is drilling the hole. So what we fall into the trap of quite often is we're so focused on the how we're going to do it without really getting to the underlying what's that thing it's truly going to solve. And I'm going to give you a really quick personal story that was from a class I took at Harvard that really drove this home. So for those of you that do cooking, there's this thing called a sous vide. It's a slow cooker. And we had an exercise where we had to interview our counterpart, and mine happened to be in China. And we were talking, and my job was to figure out what was the job to be done by that slow cooker. And we got talking, and it was all about the perfect steak. And we were talking about how it made these amazing steaks. And then I remembered that the important thing of the job to be done, it's a functional and an emotional job that has to get done. And when we really drilled into it, the slow cooker had nothing to do with why he bought it. It was because he only had one day with his family, and he wanted to make the most amazing meal and give his family the most amazing meal. So if all I did was optimize that slow cooking and I didn't focus on the amazing meal, I'm missing the entire reason why they bought that thing in the first place, right? So I know it's an analogy, but we do that all the time, right? We stop at that first job that we think it's solving without really drilling into it. No pun intended, actually. All right. So if we keep going on this journey, so we've kind of observed, we've figured out what the job is. Now we got to figure out is what are those roadblocks and boundaries that we've set for ourselves, right? Elon Musk has this thing called first principles, which is basically saying, figure out what the hard boundaries are. What are the boundaries that are just your own self-imposed limitations and are barriers to getting something done, and which are real, right? For him, it was, so when a spaceship gets into space, those $1 million plus booster rockets burn up on the way down, right? It was just a given. Nobody asked why. That just was the way it is. Space travel couldn't be done commercially because it couldn't be done economically. And what Elon Musk did was basically break that down and say, look, there's no law of physics saying I can't reuse a rocket booster, right? There's nothing in it, it's not a fundamental thing of you can't get more energy out of an atom. It's just, that's what we've always done. So if you think about your everyday life, right? Stopping again and asking, is this a true barrier? Maybe it is. Maybe it's a regulatory barrier. Maybe it's something that's a hard fact, right? But many of those can be changed, right? So are there real limits, or is it just something we're imposing on ourselves? Now, we all think innovation is like huge change, right? A light bulb, I'm going to create Airbnb, make $1 bazillion, right? But innovation sometimes are right in front of us, right? If you think about the stir stick from Starbucks, it was actually on a Salesforce hosted idea site for Starbucks, and it became their number one idea, right? So that simple innovation really changed people's lives from having coffee spilled all over them in the car, right? And think about another analogy is the markers, right? A simple thing of using markers before a procedure of what location is supposed to be operated on, checklists, simple changes. So sometimes the changes can be really small, but really impactful, right? So innovation doesn't always mean this giant transformation, right? It's small incremental steps that add true additive value. Now, one of the things that we stress on my team a lot is this idea called entrepreneurship, right? So everybody knows the entrepreneur. So it's gotten really popularity to say, I'm an intrapreneur, right? So what does that really mean? It means I'm going to start using the techniques of startups to drive change inside my organization. Obviously, we're motivated by different things, right? We're not just on getting a venture capital round, right? We're about making tangible, positive impacts and having both us as a team and our customers more successful. But at the end of the day, it's using those same things inside of an organization to drive change. So if we think about some of those techniques, one is think like a founder, right? So when you got that idea and you really believe in it, how do you start acting like a founder, right? First thing is you have this worthy goal, and you're probably the one that's going to wake up every day driving that with enthusiasm, right? So really taking ownership of it and thinking, I am the founder of this idea, creates a wholly different mindset where your goal is to drive through all the hurdles that you're going to have to drive through. Now, what you'll see startups do a lot is they tell their story. So what do I mean by that? That means that literally, if you think what they do, they tell everybody and anybody their story. They tell the venture capitals during all the seed rounds, right? They go on road shows. But if you do that even inside your company, what you're doing is you're validating the idea. You're getting commitment from people that might want to help you out with that, right? And you're refining your focus. So in a way, it's a great way to get feedback and also to get people to join your initiative. So basically just telling your story again and again and again with that enthusiasm can sometimes actually make the difference between success and not. I think during the day, you talked a lot about picking success measures and driving to those. Like, how do you pick out the real value points? What are those tangible measures that will make a significant difference? And then leveraging the tools of design thinking, lean startup, and agile, in a real way, though, where if you're taking that process and really try to drive the cycles of learning. The thing of it is, when you're going to drive an early MVP, too often inside a company, we get caught up into, it's got to be perfect, right? It's got to be complete. Everything's got to be automated. Even an MVP can't be messy. And there's times that's true, right? There's clinical apps, there's things that really have to be perfect, but then there's a lot that's not, right? You can start out with something that's good enough, right? That's got just enough, but picks out those key value props that you want to prove out in the field and get those in front of users, right? Because observing, again, is the number one thing, right? So if you think about like even Airbnb, when they first launched, they had no idea how important the actual pictures were, right? They were spending tons of money and time automating a bazillion things that didn't matter. And what they needed to do is really go out, and they saw from the users, if they spent their time and money on getting those pictures right, their business would take off, right? Because that was the value point. So similarly, if we do that internally and we figure out how do we get those few value points to be really crisp and work those out early, all the rest sometimes can come. And again, you're going to do this multiple times, right? So I think I heard on the last talk, it's really about the iterative journey of this is how do you get success, build on that success, add some more, do the same thing, refine and iterate again and again. And where possible, do a bit of testing, right? So there's straight testing, and then I might pick a small group and do a little A/B testing, right? So an alternate version, and see if that makes a significant difference and compare the two, right? So if you're able, not everybody's able to do this, but sometimes that's a great way to just do a little contrast or try something out as an experiment off to the side and see if it gives some value. Next, moving fast, right? There is a true value in time. So, the longer it takes, the more things move on, the more the environment changes, the less you can adapt, right? So moving fast, but that doesn't mean you have to break things, right? With the techniques of built-in testing, right? So actually putting a lot of testing, built-in testing, and in your development will let you basically regression test really fast, do new development, and just trust because you're testing, the other stuff works. right? So the ability to do that testing and leveraging a platform like, sometimes a cloud platform like Salesforce or others that let you do rapid development and deployment can go a long way. So how do we kind of bring those all together? So part of it is when we start out a new project, we go really wide, right? So when we talk about like design thinking or brainstorming, it's really thinking big, right? So trying to get as many voices as we can from as many groups, as many people, and trying not to be bound by that box we try to put ourselves in, right? Or sometimes find ourselves in. And what's really important with that is those could be really important later, right? So you may not use any of those in the first iteration, maybe even the first year. But those ideas are going to be really hard to think up later. It's strange because as you go further, you start, again, it's like a box effect, right? You kind of have this worldview and you get stuck in the view of the application you're building or the system. And it's really hard to go back and brainstorm big again. When in the beginning, the field is kind of clear and you might have ideas you can pull back in later. But still, you have to get to some critical measures of success, right? So how do we do that and figure out what's an early win? And at the end of the day, if we had to dream big, what would be like the most amazing success, right? So some of those can help motivate the teams to drive forward. The other couple suggestions we have is get the highest risk elements out of the way first, right? We don't want to push those to the end because at the end of the day, you don't want some asteroid dinosaur killing thing that's going to come later in your application or project. If you tackle those way up early, you can drive out the risk and focus more on driving the experience and driving the functionality that you want to get. Another trick too is that, while systems like Salesforce and others have tons of automation capability, and we do over time suggest automating, a lot of your thing to provide consistency, traceability, efficiency. When you're early on, you might not know if you're over automating the things that don't matter, right? So kind of that MVP iteration, going out there, maybe doing some stuff manually for the first few months, right? Don't try to automate every single thing. It doesn't have to be perfect when it goes out, right? The idea is to figure out where the real value is being driven and focus on driving those. And obviously get feedback from a lot of stakeholders. And one thing we see sometimes, and I see sometimes, is you go to your fans, right? Sometimes the no's can tell you just as much as the yeses. But back to my quote, like, don't tell me why not, show me why. You're really looking for where do they see the hurdles and let you focus on where you might have to tackle those, right? So you can sometimes learn more from your critics as you can from your fans. Now, something that can help guide you is a lean canvas model. So for those of you that are familiar with the business model canvas, these are the areas that's slightly different. So it focuses more on a project level. And one of the things, so basically trying to map what you're trying to solve with your value prop, with the way you're going to get it out there, and obviously cost and revenue. But the one that some people go, what's an unfair advantage? It's not unfair necessarily. It's what is uniquely the driver that is uniquely you, right? Maybe it's your brand, right? Maybe it's the brand of your organization is that unfair advantage. That's the unique value prop. Maybe it's the efficacy. Maybe it's you have a unique way to do that. So, or a unique value prop. So using this map to sit back and think through can sometimes help you figure out the levers as well as the gaps. Now, an interesting exercise is to do this for your team. So literally take your team and do this exercise. So as a team, what is your team's unfair advantage, right? In the organization, what do you uniquely provide? And how, if you think about what are the gaps maybe, or what are the things you can actually double down on as an organization that you want to invest in, right? So it's an interesting exercise just to even do it at a small team level as well as a project level. So all that said, we know change is extremely hard work, right? I'm sure you all face this day after day, right? Getting things to move, right? The inertia of things moving is very difficult sometimes. Obviously, telling your story again and again and getting like-minded people to join into your quest can go a long way to success, right? So in a way, sharing that story will help people come and help you out, right? I see people sometimes thinking, if I do all this stuff myself, I'm not going to get any naysayers. I'm just going to keep it going as far as I can. But at the end of the day, you want other people to buy in because in a way, it's a way to validate your idea and it's a way to get people to help you out, right? So one other hurdle. People are irrational. I got news for you, right? But actually, there's a Nobel Prize saying people are predictably irrational. So they came up with this formula, but at the end of the day, what it actually means is people are more worried about losing than gaining. So if you think about your typical user out there, even if you showed them something that was going to be amazing, they're still in their mind thinking of the pain they're going to get from losing the way they did it. So unfortunately, you do have to recognize the pain and you have to double down on the value that you're going to provide them, right? Because if you think that logic is going to do it, it's not, right? You have to get them past that hurdle over top of that. One kind of clever thing that a company called Canva did, if I'm thinking of an analogy, is they were having a really hard time with their online design system. They're actually a huge company now. They were having a hard time getting people to use their online design system. And what they did to take down that fear factor was they literally made you do a little game in the beginning, right? Before you got to use the actual application, you had to go do a few changes and change this color and move this widget and do a few things that took down that fear factor and took down their perceived pain and actually drove that user onto the next stage. Now, I'm not saying you're going to build games in your applications, but just thinking about how you get people comfortable with that first hurdle is extremely important. Right? One other bad news. Every project's going to go through the valley of despair, right? I don't know that I've ever seen one that didn't. So you start out, you're all enthusiastic, you're going, and then all of a sudden you hit roadblocks, right? It's either time, money, something you just hadn't expected, and you could stay there and stay in the valley, or I think the thing that tends to get you out of it is the why, right? So you and the team being focused on that why you had in the beginning, and this is why I think that's so important, is if you really think about what the value you're going to bring and what's the goodness that you're going to add to your organization, and along the way, you've told this story so many times, you're really committed to it, that will get you past it, right? And ideally, with the help of the other people in the team, you'll get to the end of the journey. So we talked about a lot of stuff. My number one suggestion is really just start by observing. Why are things the way they are? What can we do? What kind of projects? What kind of initiatives? And a third of them never come to fruition, but the third that do make all the difference, right? And a lot of that really starts with just observing what's possible and what you can do to change it. And lastly, I'll give you a few practical guides to get started, right? There's a few books out there I'd recommend. One is Thinker Toys. It's a structured book of ways to think through ideation, right? How to do the opposite, combine, merge, flip. Basically, what are the 90 techniques you can use to unstick that box that you're in? Creativity Inc.'s a really interesting book about how setting constraints on time can actually drive creativity. So almost a tight, loose organization. How do you have a loose ideation, but a bounded set of goals, right? And how that can drive creativity even more. That was actually Pixar, story of Pixar. Six thinking hats is coming at a problem with different perspectives, right? So think about stakeholders, personas. How can you use those to rethink the view of the problem? Hooked is really interesting. You might not use it, but Hooked is more about how do you create applications or things that are a little sticky, right? How do you make them a little bit addictive? Where it comes in useful sometimes is, let's say there's a bit of data you really need people to enter in the system, and they're really resistant to do it, right? So how do I set up kind of reward structures to almost make it a bit addictive so that they will actually do that entry? Just a very, very interesting twist on things. And lastly, Love Marks was written by Pepsi, somebody from Pepsi. It's, I would say, similar to your organization, right? How do you become a brand that people feel like is part of the family, right? How do you become a brand that people automatically warm up to? And how do you reinforce that? And with that, I'd just like to say thank you. And hopefully, if you pick up even one little tip out of today and actually give it a try, I hope you the best of success. So we often don't, we might have a kickoff meeting to kind of set the bounds of what we're trying to do, but we really don't solve it there. What we do is we create one shared document and we put in everything we can find that already exists on that. And what that does is it kind of, you have this wealth of information in your organization probably that might be somewhat related. And that almost forms like a nucleus of ideas to be able to recombine and readapt or leverage. And then we just start a brainstorming, right? So part of the trick is if you do it in person, too often it's the loudest person, right? So to start, we usually do an offline brainstorming. Let's just list out as many things we can think around this idea. And then what we do is we get together and then we do the brainstorming in person, right? How do we start narrowing this down? How do we start figuring out how we're going to take the nucleus of what that is and figure out what's a tangible next step we can do? So it's kind of that synchronous and asynchronous brainstorming. But we always do the asynchronous one first because we want to have the widest view and not, it's kind of like in a meeting, if somebody holds the pen, whoever holds that pen first sets the direction for the rest of the meeting, right? If you do the brainstorming, whoever talks first can shut down 30 ideas, right? That people, now that they just forget what they were going to say. Or if I, as a manager, say something, I'm automatically limiting the discussion, right? Just because of my position. So we try to do the asynchronous version first, so I get kind of the full breadth of the ideas out there, right? So that simple act of asking, sometimes you'd be amazed what people already know they could be doing. And by flipping it around and giving people the latitude and license to be a little more of an entrepreneur, we'll let more and more of those ideas bubble up from the bottom, right? So if upper management isn't asking too often, and even then, they're going to prioritize it. And, there's a thing called disruptive strategy. They're going to do more of what they already know. If you're doing things that don't necessarily fit the box, they almost always have to come from the bottom up. So, some of those real changes, because they're not going to be bound by some budget or some schedule, or, they're a little more free to germinate and grow. They can sometimes be some of the biggest changes, right? I think if you don't have that, you're missing a lot of opportunities and not letting people necessarily grow to their full potential, right? Another really important part of this is if you look at the leadership that we've grown out of the team, a lot of it has been by being an entrepreneur, right? Taking ownership, finding other people, developing some leadership skills, driving projects, driving deadlines, and then doing things that they can show and prove as accomplishments as part of the career journey. So it's basically for them and for the organization. I think there's benefits both ways. Thank you for joining us and would love to hear your feedback and thoughts. Feel free to reach out and all the best on your journey.